Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name's John Gershman. I'm clinical professor of public service at NYU Wagner, and would like to welcome everyone to the inaugural session in the fall 2022 Conflict, Security, and Development series. This is a series that is a collaboration between half a dozen programs here at NYU, and just want to thank them quickly. The Center for Global Affairs at NYU School of Professional Studies, the Program in International Relations at NYU's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, the Robert Bernstein Institute for Human Rights, excuse me, at NYU Law School, the International Education Program at NYU Steinhardt School, and our Office of International Programs here at NYU Wagner. We're incredibly excited to have Evan Lieberman, professor of political science at MIT, who's going to discuss his new book, Until We Have Won Our Liberty, South Africa After Apartheid. And for all of those luckily attending, we will post a discount code in the chat for all of you to get the book. We're in a kind of webinar format here, so feel free to throw questions into the Q&A. Evan's going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes or so, and then I'll throw him questions afterwards. So without further ado, Evan.
Great, thanks, John. I'm always grateful to John and to NYU Wagner, who hosted me a couple of different times over the years, and so great to be back, if virtually, and I'm delighted to chat with you all today about this new book. So I'm going to share screen, and can you see that?
Oh, good.
Good, great. Great, so looking forward to chatting with you all and to your questions. You know, this is not somewhere between a scholarly book and a trade book, and you might get a sense of that from the presentation today. I will not share any regression tables, but there's a little bit of data, this is, you know, really a book that's focused very much on South Africa, but I hope that there's some general lessons that are useful for the United States and for people who are thinking about this challenge of democracy and the threats to democracy all around the world. So I've been working on South Africa for a very long time. I was a student at that fancy private school that's a few miles from where I imagine many of you are sitting from NYU. And at the tender age of 16, I wrote my first piece ever on South Africa, as my school, turned out, I got a tip, was actually invested in apartheid South Africa. And I realized that, you know, there might be some younger people in the audience who don't even fully know what apartheid is. I come up against that, and sometimes I'm surprised. And I'll just say briefly, you know, it was this system of white rule, right? Apartheid meant apartness. And you had in this country of South Africa, you know, over 80% of the population were really relegated to second or third class citizenship and excluded from real political participation or leadership. And so the big strategy that a lot of schools and universities were using to challenge this really unjust regime was divestment. And so that was in 1986. And a few years later, I look a little different there. I was a college student. I had the opportunity to travel to South Africa just a little over a year after Nelson Mandela was released and as apartheid was ending. And I was beginning to think as a young person about what that future might be like. And somehow this incredible political project that started in justice and transition led me to want to write this book several decades later, because I've been thinking about and studying South Africa for my entire adult life. And wanted to ask what I think is the big question was, you know, this transition. 1994, the election of Mandela ushered in this multiracial democracy, and really something of an experiment, because who knew how could you address this incredibly unjust past? And looking back from the perspective of 25 years, so I really was focused on 2019, looking backwards, quarter century, was it a success or failure? And also providing an opportunity to think about what's the value of democracy more generally, having being close to my friend Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky wrote this book about how democracies die, all of us aware of the threats to democracy in the US and around the world, in part because some are saying, well, you don't really need this democracy thing, that there are better ways, and wanted to be able to address that bigger question. I did this even though I've been thinking about and studying the whole country, I wanted to zero in on one particular space in order to really, first of all, get to know some new people, new places, see whether ideas I had about the country would resonate if I went kind of out of sample from the places that were familiar to me. And so I focused on a single municipality, the municipality of Makale City, which is a municipality of about 500,000 people. It borders Johannesburg to the west, and it's centered in a town of Krugersdorp, which is located in kind of the south center of the municipality. But it's really kind of on the urban periphery, because these larger areas that you see in this map in the lower right here are more rural areas. So it's in some ways a microcosm of the country. It has a very deep apartheid past, but it also has large Black urban areas, and it has both urban and farmland areas to it. And I went there trying to study South Africa retrospectively from the perspective of the national elections that were going to be in May of 2019. And so I went to Krugersdorp, the center of Makale City, to meet a research assistant in late January, just during the last weekend of voter registration. And the woman who is from Kagiso, this nearby Black township, said, well, why don't you just meet me at the Chicken Licken, which is kind of in the center of the municipality. It's near where the mayor sits. So it'll be easy for you. I think she assumed as a American, I would really find it difficult to navigate. She wanted me to be in the most central place that we could meet, useful because it was near the election commission office. We're sitting down, and within 10 minutes, literally, is the first day I go there, a massive protest is ongoing right outside the window, and the manager shutting down all of the metal gates outside the windows, and there are several thousand people coming from another Black township, Muncieville, toy-toying, coming to complain to the ANC mayor about all the problems that they're facing. And it kind of was a reminder. I don't know that I necessarily needed reminding because it was pretty abundantly clear, but it really captured the fact that there's so many challenges ongoing in South Africa. And I was looking at that in 2019, but they're certainly true and exacerbated today. 3 years later, after the COVID pandemic, the country is facing what they call stage 6 load shedding, which means there's just perpetual rolling blackouts, so people don't have access to electricity, unbelievably high levels of unemployment, pretty low economic growth. There's quite a bit of crime and violence around Makale City, and as there is nationally. South Africa is, certainly one of the most, if not the most, unequal economically society on the planet. Many reports about corruption, and across race groups, there's still a fair bit of conflict, right? So there's a lot of, if you're looking for things to be upset about, there are a lot of things to be frustrated and upset about. And there's pretty widespread perceptions of failure, and lots of people saying, really, what this country needs is a benevolent dictator, okay? At the national level in 2016, over half of South Africans said they were dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with democracy. That grew to 60% in 2018. I haven't looked at the more recent survey data, but I'm going to guess it might even be higher. And in Makale City, where I conducted my own survey in 2019, kind of amazingly to me, when asked about comparing how is life today compared to life under apartheid, maybe not so surprising that over half of whites said, life was better back then. But 50% of Black citizens, and I was only interviewing people 40 and older, said life was better back then, which was kind of harsh and stunning for me to hear. So I want to give you, I'm giving you this picture, but I want to say this. If you ask me the question, what is the argument in my book, has democracy been a success during the first 25 years since Mandela? My answer actually is yes. Okay, and that's one of the arguments of the book. It's somewhat controversial if you want, certainly in light of, I think, conventional wisdom and all of the books that are currently being written about South Africa. But I need to clarify, obviously, what do I mean by success? And obviously, democracy has not been a panacea for all of South Africa's many ills. I think that it has helped create what I call dignified development, which is to say that citizens have been made more visible and they've been increasingly recognized for their equal value as humans through the various institutions of democratic practice. There have been substantial improvements in material welfare that we can't take for granted. Citizens, and again, especially the Black, and that I mean in terms of all people of color in South Africa, which is over 80% of the population, have been given a meaningful, quite meaningful voice in politics and leadership. Now, the process of democratic practice is really just, it's messy. And in some ways, I think that they're just muddling through. But why do I say success? Because I think a lot about the counterfactuals, about what could have happened in the country under a different kind of political system, and what, if we think about the state of South Africa in the late 80s and early 90s, what trajectory that country was on, right? So we really need to think about it from that perspective, not just to say, wow, this is a country that has a lot of problems. It was a democracy, ergo democracy must have been a failure. So what was my approach to assessing the success of South Africa's democracy? One was to look historically. And again, I focused both, I kind of zoomed in on this place, Machale City, but also zoomed out and looked at the national picture to see whether or not what happened in Machale was reflective or somewhat of an outlier compared to the rest of the country. I also at times look comparatively to look at trends and certain kinds of outcomes across other upper middle income countries and across other African countries. I try and look at the 1955 Freedom Charter, which was this incredible document. It was this democratically created document that was the product of various assemblies of people in non-racial settings around the country, which was incredibly unique for South Africa of that time, and became the kind of lifeblood of the African National Congress. Clearly was not the only important political movement in South Africa of anti-apartheid resistance, but given that the ANC would eventually hold power, the Freedom Charter very much became the basis for the 1996 Constitution. And the title of the book, Until We Won Our Liberty, is in fact from the final sentence of the Freedom Charter. And also benchmarked against what happened against a lot of the quite dismal theories and predictions. In the book, I also consider a lot of the hopes, expectations, and subjective views of citizens. But that's a tough one because it's a moving target, right? People become habituated to progress and expect, and want something different. And as I talk about in the book, and I won't talk about too much today, we humans have something of a negativity bias, right? We grab onto the things that are troubling and upsetting to us much more than we retain the good news. So I try and use as much as I can objective facts, but I also think obviously the subjective views of citizens is important, particularly when we're thinking about democratic politics. So one really important prediction was that South Africa was going to become a one-party state. All right. The ANC had so much popularity at the, going into the 1994 election. A lot of post-colonial countries went on to become, single-party dominant and bordered on and quickly became much more authoritarian. My own doctoral advisor, Ruth Collier, attended this conference hosted by some South African academics in which they wanted to look at the models of Mexico and a few other countries. I'm not remember what the other ones were. Just saying, look at the ways in which South Africa is likely to follow these paths, like the PRI of Mexico. And there are still people today who will say, yes, there's no political competition in South Africa. It's essentially a one-party system. I really don't think that that's true. If you look, first of all, at the voting patterns. So in red, what I am showing are the proportional representation national election returns, the proportion that went to the ANC, which was Mandela's party, the African National Congress, and in, I guess, what we would call turquoise, the share of PR vote at the local level. And you could see in the first couple of elections that the ANC did gain increasing shares of the vote. People were excited about the ANC. It was the party of Mandela. They had faith in the party. The people lost any interest in the old ruling party, the National Party. And by 2004, the ANC even got a supermajority, which gave them a lot of room, if they wanted to rewrite the Constitution according to how they saw fit, which they didn't do for the most part. But after the mid-2000s, you can see it's been a pretty steady decline, a lot of vigorous challenge from other political parties at the national level. The most recent election was the worst ever for the ANC, but they still, managed to pull it out. For sure, the ANC has been in charge of government throughout the post-apartheid history. But importantly, at the local level, which is a very important sphere of government for South Africa, and particularly in the major urban municipalities where so much of the economy sits, where millions of people live, there's been not just this decline in ANC vote share, but many municipalities and many urban municipalities of the 8 big cities have gone into coalition, often with a complete exclusion of the ANC. So this is not, to my mind, a one-party state. This is increasingly vigorous electoral competition following, a not particularly unexpected, solid showings by the ANC. And it's been a pretty vibrant democracy, right? So like I said, increasing electoral competition. There's a very strong critical media, which really challenges the government in various ways, and on social media, a largely independent judiciary, an engaged civil society, and a pretty autonomous business sector. To just take my word for it, if we look at the varieties of democracy scores on the left, you can see in black how South Africa compares on this electoral democracy score over time compared to other upper middle income countries, and then on the right compared to other African countries. So, it's been a solidly democratic country. And I actually think it's held leaders accountable. Again, a lot of the conventional wisdom is, there's no accountability in South Africa. Jacob Zuma, by any kind of reasonable standard, not a particularly good leader, someone who was engaged in a lot of corruption, not very long, not in a very long view of the future, pretty narrow in his interests. That's not what we judge democracy on. It's not the quality of leaders, but it's how they are held in check by society, by the people. And when Jacob Zuma decided at one point during his presidency, I'm going to get rid of this very good finance minister and put in place someone who's just a real loyalist to him, well, the markets tanked. The press wrote really damning articles about this, and the business sector complained, and Zuma was embarrassed and very quickly put into place someone who was much more acceptable and had a good track record on economic management. Similarly, it was found, Zuma was engaged in a lot of corruption, including that he took money for his own, personal home. The top court declared that the renovations were illegal, and he was actually forced to pay back the money. I don't think all of it, but he literally took out a mortgage and had to pay back the money that he had taken to build a pool and his own home. There were a lot of protests about Zuma and what a terrible leader he was. And the ANC eventually, for various reasons, withdrew him from being president and put Ramaphosa in place. So again, accountable for everything? Maybe not, but to me, there's been a lot of executive accountability, many other stories that I talk about in the book. Now, a lot of people will say to you, yeah, there's been, and they've certainly said it to me, there's been no change in South Africa since 1994. This government has done nothing. And again, I disagree. For sure, economic growth has not been the highlight of the post-apartheid era. So I just, I provide for you this GDP per capita growth chart, and you can see the blue line in 1994. I mean, it's certainly worth noting that economic growth before the end of apartheid was pretty bad. There were a lot of sanctions. The mining economy was not doing so well. And the country actually did have some growth, albeit not as robust as they would have liked to deal with all the problems that they needed, but there was some growth, even in per capita terms after 1994. But in 2009, the country really got crushed by the global economic meltdown, right? Which also happened to coincide, I think coincidentally, with Jacob Zuma becoming president, right? So we see this huge dip, and frankly, South Africa just did not recover the way a lot of other countries, including in the global South and Africa and among other upper middle income countries, didn't recover after 2009 in the same way. And the country also got crushed by COVID, as many economies around the world did. Looks like there's been some rebound in 2021. But if your theory was, do democracies cause growth? South Africa would not be a great case study in favor of that theory. I grant that. But it has been really good in terms of, on the one hand, providing more equitable services. Unbelievable backlogs in basic services along racial lines in South Africa starting in 1994. But based on my research just in Makali City, you can see before and after the dotted lines on the left in terms of access to piped water, and on the right in terms of access to electricity. You can see the gaps have not completely closed between white and black, but there's been a lot of closure, even as white service delivery has also improved over time. Looking nationally, also, very similar story with about 45% of households having piped water, just around the end of apartheid, start of the new democracy, grows to over 80% 2 decades later, less than 60% with electricity in 96, about 90% by 2016, and today it's over 90%, albeit those increases in connections have also meant surges on the overall infrastructure, and that's a good part of the reason why they've had these blackouts. Increases in formal dwellings. There has been a very expansive, albeit not universal, public housing program. So you see huge gains over most of the post-apartheid era in terms of people being able to live in formal dwellings. And poverty, there are lots of different ways, as you all at a policy school know, of measuring poverty. But by most measures I've looked at over the post-apartheid period, there have been important decreases, particularly in extreme poverty. So beyond that, I want to talk, the notion of dignified development, as I've tried to characterize to all of you so far, has involved these improvement in material conditions. It's involved more opportunities for people to participate politically, to be involved in political leadership, and to hold leaders accountable. But at the core of dignity is respect for each other as humans. And this was an important part of the research that I found, more kind of I'm going to call it quasi-ethnographically. So, I reached out through a contact to a pastor from Muncieville, again, which is one of the Black townships. And certainly during the Q&A, I know that I'm assuming maybe some familiarity with some terms about South Africa. And if I've used any language that is unclear, I hope you'll ask, because I want to be able to clarify and not obfuscate. But these Black townships that were created as places for Black people to live under the kind of institutionalized white supremacy of the prior era continue to be where large numbers of Black people in South Africa live. And so, I contacted a pastor and I said, I wanted to talk to him about the history of the township. And he said, let me get together, some of my friends who are also pastors in other townships in Makali City. Let's meet for coffee at the Mug and Bean, which was at a mall in downtown Krugersdorp. And I thought I was going to use this just as an opportunity to qualitatively hear the history of changes in service delivery. So I spoke with these three men, and one of them said to me, "Look, yes, there's been a lot of change, but the change since 1994, it's not just about material things, right? It's about Ubuntu, right? It's about a human being treated and feeling like a human." And they said, "Look, I'm free now to come into this town, to a white, relatively affluent area, of a meeting with a white guy like you, and it's just no big deal, right?" And again, if you could think about what the history of this particular town was like, where they were reminiscent of segregation era America, but to much greater extremes, different buses for white people versus for people of color, different places to live, curfews for Black people. He still wasn't taking for granted the fact that today it was really just everywhere in the mall, everywhere where people were eating, people from different races were intermingling, quite casually. And he said to me, "Look outside." And there was a line of people. I don't have photographs, so you're just going to have to, bear with my imagination here, or memories. But we were looking out in a window onto the parking lot, and he said, "What do you see?" And I have fairly American-style racial lens when I look into groups of people, which turns out to be an appropriate lens for looking at some aspects of South Africa. And I said, "Well, I guess I see a white guy, towards the end of this line of mostly Black people." And that was exactly the point that he wanted to make. And I said, "What are these guys doing?" And he's like, "Well, look, they're all waiting online. Today is the day that the government has deposited into people's accounts a monthly cash grant. South Africa has a very extensive system of cash grants, which aren't particularly large, but they are really important in helping keep people out of extreme poverty. And so people were going to the cash machine in order to get the money. And they just pointed out, look, in the previous era, that white guy certainly wouldn't have waited at the back of the line. He wouldn't have even been willing to wait on the same line, and certainly not for the same sized cash grant. But on that day, this white guy was safe. No one was going, he was part of the new South Africa, and he wasn't, he was someone who qualified for a cash grant as well. And there's actually, a not insignificant population of relatively poor white people in this municipality. But he was waiting online with dignity and respect, just the way everyone else was. And that's just the way it was. And it was completely different from the way things once were. And, again, it's just important to think about the past quarter century, now almost past 3 decades, in some historical perspective, right? And obviously I go into this in much more detail in the book, but this area around Mahali City, Krugersdorp, was named after Paul Kruger. And to study the biography of Paul Kruger is amazingly reminiscent of Donald Trump, of other white nationalists in terms of his attitudes and his rhetoric, his authoritarian tendencies. And he was a leader of Afrikaners who helped to establish this new mining town, right? So Mahali City was, Krugersdorp was built as a mining town when gold was discovered nearby in the late 19th century. And this area was extremely violent. It was very much like the Wild West in that there were people who were coming to this area in order to get quick fortunes. And very quickly, there were, because there had already been literally centuries of ideas of white supremacy enshrined in the larger region of Southern Africa, this area around Krugersdorp was regulated so that there would be privileged opportunities for whites, wage rates and home conditions were very much suppressed for Black Africans who were brought on to work on the mines. And early in the 20th century, people had to have passes, Black people, in order to come into the white area. This thing, apartheid, didn't come about until 1948, but it was just an elaboration in many ways of these early institutions that segregated citizenship. So again, it's against this backdrop. And again, I recognize it's easy for an outsider to come in and take this long perspective, but I think it's an important one because, when people talk, oh, things have become so violent or things have become so unequal. The reality is that this is an area that was so violent, that was so unequal. And today, so many of those old problems still persist, but it's actually a pretty peaceful area. People within reason, everyday interactions are respectful, and it's a world of difference. It's hard to measure respect for other people, let's say using surveys, but at least one way in which we can do it is looking at the World Values Survey over time. They have this question: who would you not want to have as a neighbor? And if you look in the 1982, and kind of still when apartheid was running strong, over 40% of white people said, I wouldn't want to have a person of a different race as a neighbor. And, after apartheid, you can see that both whites and Blacks, it's not as if this has gone down to zero or to nothing. There's still a significant number of, a non-trivial number of both white and Black people in South Africa who say they don't feel comfortable having neighbors of a different race group. But again, it's a world of difference from what was. And one of the things I talk about in the book, and it's not just about race, right? The democratic project in South Africa, and in particular, the enshrining of various forms of rights with a focus on human dignity has provided, has afforded much more respect for women. Again, this is, we can measure that in lots of ways. But one important one, again, the Varieties Democracy Project uses expert coders to compare across countries. And you can see there are these big changes. I will say that in one really important area, just the opposite has happened. And, and I'm happy to talk about that. But that's in terms of the respectful treatment of people who don't have South African citizenship, right? That's been an abysmal failure, one that's intensifying, one that's upsetting for important reasons. But I would say, that's on the one hand. In lots of other areas, respectful treatment has overall gotten much better. So let me wrap up with just a few points, and then I'll really look forward to engaging your comments and questions. I've been engaged in a lot of conversations with a lot of folks about, South Africa. Is it at a crossroads? Is it at a precipice? There are a lot of big challenges in South Africa, just as there are in a lot of countries around the world, in Africa, the United States, Europe. I mean, we are going through difficult times all around the world. And South Africa has a lot of quite serious problems. But the starting point of the late 80s and early 90s was pretty awful. And we can't lose sight of that, particularly if we were trying to understand the value of this political experiment that came in between. And my conclusion is that democracy is working in its pretty messy ways, right? It is helping, not in a completely linear path, to provide a more dignified existence for larger and larger shares of the population. And I think that this is an important case to make because we live at this moment in which democracy is being called into question by citizens, by leaders all around the world. And many of us spend most of our time focusing on what's going wrong, right? That's, we haven't solved inequality. We haven't solved COVID. We haven't solved racial reconciliation. And it's right to continue to put a finger on those problems and to say that these things haven't been solved. But we also need to play a role in highlighting that if it's true that democracy and democratic practice, when it's inclusionary, when it involves enshrining key rights, if it can, to put a spotlight on what works and not always look at the glass half empty, or else we're playing a role in delegitimating the value of democracy. But of course, this was a study in which I'm looking backwards. I do think things politically are very uncertain in South Africa at the moment. And there's no guarantee that things will continue to be democratic, or that some of the positive outcomes that I've depicted here will continue into the future. But I still think it's important for us to recognize them if we want to have a full picture of the value of democracy. So let me stop there.